"Sir, if you sign that contract, your company won't belong to you anymore." The words were soft, almost careful, yet they cut through the polished silence of the glass-walled boardroom like a sudden crack in ice. Every head at the long walnut table turned at once. At the far end of the room, Daniel Whitmore, the white-haired CEO of Whitmore Technologies, paused with a fountain pen hovering just inches above a contract worth nearly $400 million. For a moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of traffic 20 floors below on Market Street. Daniel slowly lifted his eyes. The faint, confident smile that had rested on his face all morning didn't disappear immediately, but it shifted, tightening slightly, as if he were unsure he had heard correctly. Standing near the wall, half hidden beside a projection screen, was Ava Brooks, the youngest person in the room and easily the least powerful. She wore a simple navy blazer that looked a little too big for her shoulders, and in front of her sat a thin stack of documents she had been quietly reviewing while the senior lawyers spoke. Ava wasn't a partner, or a consultant, or even a junior attorney. She was an intern, a black law student who had only been at Whitmore Technologies for 3 weeks, and until that moment no one in the room had paid her more attention than they might give a coffee cup left on the table. A few executives exchanged confused glances. One of the board members leaned back in his leather chair with a short, skeptical laugh, as if expecting someone to explain the interruption. But Ava didn't move away from the table. Her eyes stayed on the contract lying in front of the CEO, on page 32, where a narrow column of legal language hid between dense paragraphs of corporate terminology. The city sunlight streamed through the tall windows behind the boardroom table, reflecting off the polished surface and lighting the paper with a pale glow. Ava could feel the weight of the room pressing toward her, the subtle disbelief, the quiet assumption that someone like her shouldn't be the one interrupting a deal of this size. Daniel Whitmore rested the pen slowly against the paper, but did not sign. His gaze moved from Ava to the contract and back again. Curiosity now replacing the easy confidence he carried into the meeting. Around him sat lawyers who had billed hundreds of hours reviewing the agreement, consultants who had negotiated the deal for months, and directors who had flown across the country to watch the final signature happen. Yet the only person in the room who looked completely certain in that moment was the intern standing near the screen. Ava drew in a steady breath, her voice calm but unwavering. "Clause 17b, she said quietly, pointing to the page. "It transfers liability in a way that looks routine at first, but if you read the language carefully, it doesn't just protect the other company. It hands them control." The confident smile on the CEO's face faded completely as the room fell into a deeper, sharper silence. Ava Brooks had learned long ago that people rarely listened to the quiet person in the room, especially when that person looked like they did not belong there. 3 weeks earlier, she had walked through the revolving doors of Whitmore Technologies for the first time with a visitor badge clipped to her blazer and a borrowed briefcase her aunt had found at a thrift store in Detroit for $12. The marble lobby alone had been larger than the entire apartment she grew up in, and the giant digital display in the center of the building rotated through images of satellites, software platforms, and clean energy projects that Whitmore Technologies funded around the world. To most of the executives upstairs, this building was simply their workplace, but to Ava it had felt like stepping into a different universe. Her father still worked nights cleaning office buildings back in Detroit, pushing a quiet janitor cart down long fluorescent hallways while listening to old gospel music through a small radio clipped to the handle. He used to tell her that every floor he cleaned looked powerful from the outside, but underneath the desks and glass walls people were just people trying to make decisions they hoped were the right ones. Ava carried those words with her when she left for law school, studying commercial law with a determination that came from watching her family lose nearly everything because of a contract no one fully understood. When she was 16, her father signed a financing agreement for a small delivery Ben he hoped would help him start a side business. The document had seemed simple enough until a hidden clause allowed the lender to double the interest rate after a missed payment. Within months the van was repossessed, and the debt followed them like a shadow for years. Ava never forgot the way her father stared at those pages late at night at the kitchen table, tracing the lines with his finger as if the meaning might change if he read them slowly enough. That memory had quietly shaped the way she studied every document placed in front of her. When Whitmore Technologies accepted her into their summer legal internship program, she did not arrive expecting to change the company or impress the board of directors. She expected to sit quietly, observe carefully, and learn how decisions were made in rooms like the one she now stood inside. Yet while the lawyers debated projections and investment strategy earlier that morning, Ava had done what she always did when a contract appeared in front of her. She read every line. At first, the agreement between Whitmore Technologies and Kane Strategic Ventures seemed routine, filled with standard language about intellectual property sharing and joint research rights. But halfway through the document, she noticed something that made her slow down. A phrase repeated in two separate sections, both tied to a liability transfer clause buried deep in the legal wording. The language was subtle, almost elegant in the way it concealed its meaning, but the effect was unmistakable once she followed the chain of responsibility outlined in the text. If the agreement were executed exactly as written, Whitmore Technologies would assume legal exposure for future developments while Kane Strategic Ventures retained the right to claim ownership over the resulting technology. It was the kind of clause that looked harmless to anyone skimming quickly through the pages, but devastating to anyone who signed it. And now the entire boardroom waited while the youngest person in the building stood quietly beside the table, watching the most powerful man in the company read the line she had just pointed to. Daniel Whitmore did not rush when he read important documents, and everyone in the room knew it. The 70-year-old founder of Whitmore Technologies had built his reputation on a single principle that employees repeated like a quiet company legend. Daniel Whitmore never signed anything he did not fully understand. The company that now occupied 40 floors of glass and steel in the center of San Francisco had started more than 3 decades earlier with a rented workspace barely larger than a 2-car garage in Palo Alto. Back then, Daniel had been a young engineer with 1 computer server, 2 folding tables, and a belief that advanced logistics software could transform the way global supply chains operated. Most investors had ignored him during those early years, but Daniel Whitmore had never been someone who waited for approval. He worked 16-hour days, slept on an office couch when deadlines approached, and slowly built a company that now employed more than 12,000 people across the United States. In the business world, Daniel Whitmore had a reputation that was both admired and feared. He negotiated directly, he expected precision, and he rarely tolerated interruptions once a deal reached the signing stage. That was why the executives sitting around the boardroom table looked increasingly uncomfortable as he continued reading the page Ava Brooks had pointed toward. Normally by this point in a meeting, Daniel would have already signed the document, shaken hands with the partners involved, and moved the conversation toward the next strategic objective. Today was supposed to be one of those routine milestones. The agreement with Kane Strategic Ventures had been discussed for months and promoted internally as a partnership that would allow Whitmore Technologies to expand its artificial intelligence logistics platform into new international markets. Victor Kane himself sat halfway down the table in a tailored charcoal suit, his posture relaxed as if he had attended hundreds of meetings just like this one. His company specialized in acquiring promising technologies and scaling them through global partnerships, and he had spent the past hour speaking confidently about future growth, projected revenue, and market dominance. From every outward sign, the deal appeared carefully balanced, mutually beneficial, and ready for execution. Yet Daniel Whitmore was no longer smiling as he turned the page slowly and read the narrow column of language near the bottom of the document. The pen that had hovered over the signature line moments earlier now rested quietly against the polished wood table. Across the room, Ava Brooks remained standing exactly where she had been when she spoke. She did not try to explain further, and she did not interrupt the silence. Instead, she watched the subtle changes in Daniel Whitmore's expression as the meaning of the clause unfolded line by line. A few board members shifted in their seats while one of the senior attorneys quietly adjusted his glasses and leaned forward to follow the same section of text. Victor Kane still appeared calm, but the faint crease forming at the corner of his eyes suggested that even he understood something unexpected had entered the room. For the first time since the meeting began, the most powerful man in the company was no longer preparing to sign a contract. He was studying it carefully, as if the document had suddenly revealed a hidden message that no one else had noticed until the intern standing beside the screen had quietly pointed directly at it. Daniel Whitmore read the same paragraph twice before he finally looked up from the contract. The room remained perfectly still, as if no one wanted to be the first to disturb the quiet tension that had settled over the polished conference table. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon sun reflected off the glass towers of downtown San Francisco, but inside the boardroom the atmosphere had changed completely. What had begun as a routine signing ceremony now felt like a moment suspended in uncertainty. Daniel slowly placed the pen beside the document and leaned back in his chair, his eyes returning to the young intern who had spoken only a minute earlier. "Miss Brooks," he said in a calm but measured voice, "explain what you see." The request surprised several people at the table. One of the senior attorneys shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure whether the intern should be given the floor in a meeting of this level. Victor Kane also leaned slightly forward, his expression polite but guarded, as though he were waiting to hear how far the interruption might go. Ava Brooks felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward her, yet she did not hesitate. She stepped closer to the edge of the table and opened the copy of the contract in front of her. Her voice remained steady, quiet enough that everyone had to listen carefully. Clause 17B transfers legal exposure for any technology developed under this partnership, she began, tracing the line with her finger. At first it appears balanced, because both companies are mentioned in the language. But if you follow the reference sections in the appendix, the ownership rights remain exclusively with Kane Strategic Ventures. A few executives exchanged puzzled looks while the chief legal officer leaned forward to read along. Ava continued, her explanation careful and precise. That means Whitmore Technologies would assume the liability if the product fails, if there is a regulatory dispute, or if a future partner files a claim. But the intellectual property rights would not belong to Whitmore Technologies. They would belong to Kane Strategic Ventures. Victor Kane smiled slightly, though the smile no longer carried the same relaxed confidence it had earlier. That interpretation seems a bit dramatic, he said smoothly. These clauses are standard in collaborative development agreements. Ava nodded respectfully before answering. Some language is standard, she said. But the cross-reference in Section 42 changes the structure. It moves final ownership into a secondary licensing framework controlled by your company. The chief legal officer adjusted his glasses again and flipped to the appendix Ava mentioned. The quiet sound of turning pages spread around the table as several executives began scanning the same section. Daniel Whitmore remained silent, his attention fixed on the document in front of him. For the first time since the meeting began, doubt had entered the room. Ava closed the folder gently after finishing her explanation, then stepped back from the table. She did not raise her voice or defend her point further. She simply waited, knowing that the truth hidden in the language of the contract was already beginning to reveal itself to the people powerful enough to recognize what it meant. The silence that followed Ava Brooks's explanation felt heavier than anything spoken so far. Several executives continued scanning the contract, their eyes moving back and forth across the legal language, as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less troubling. The chief legal officer leaned closer to the document and slowly turned another page toward the appendix Ava had mentioned. For a few seconds no one spoke. Then Victor Kane let out a short, polite laugh that sounded practiced rather than natural. "I think we might be overanalyzing a routine structure," he said calmly, folding his hands on the table. "Partnership agreements often assign liability differently from ownership. That does not mean Whitmore Technologies loses anything." His tone remained smooth, but the relaxed confidence from earlier had faded slightly. Daniel Whitmore did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the head of the legal department. "Robert," he said quietly, "walk us through Section 42. Robert Ellis had worked with Whitmore Technologies for nearly 15 years and had reviewed thousands of contracts during his career. He adjusted the documents in front of him and cleared his throat before speaking. "The intern is correct about the reference structure," he said slowly. Clause 17B appears balanced on the surface, but when combined with Section 42, the ownership framework shifts. If the language remains unchanged, Kane Strategic Ventures retains final intellectual property rights. One of the board members straightened in his chair. "Are you saying we would fund development, but not control the technology?" Robert hesitated before answering. "Under this interpretation, yes. Whitmore Technologies would absorb the operational liability, while Kane's strategic ventures would control licensing rights for future applications. The room grew noticeably quieter. Several executives who had earlier seemed impatient now leaned forward to read the same sections Ava had pointed out. Victor Kane maintained his composed posture, but his eyes moved briefly toward Daniel Whitmore, as if measuring the shift in the conversation. Again, Kane said, still polite, "These clauses were designed to simplify international expansion. My legal team believed this structure would protect both organizations." Ava remained near the side of the table, listening, but not interrupting. She had said everything she needed to say. The rest now belonged to the people responsible for the decision. Daniel Whitmore slowly closed the folder in front of him and rested his hands together on the table. The expression on his face had changed from curiosity to something more serious, the kind of quiet focus employees recognized when the company's founder was weighing a critical choice. He looked once more at the contract, then across the table toward Victor Kane. "This partnership was described to my board as a shared investment in technology development," Daniel said calmly. "Yet the language here suggests something else entirely." Kane offered a careful smile. "Contracts can always be revised if there is confusion." Daniel Whitmore nodded once, but he did not reach for the pen again. Instead, he looked briefly toward Ava Brooks, standing near the window. The young intern had not raised her voice, had not argued, and had not tried to prove anyone wrong. She had simply pointed to a single line of legal text and allowed the truth hidden inside it to surface. And now the entire boardroom understood that what appeared to be a routine agreement only minutes earlier had become something very different. No one in the room reached for their phone, no one whispered to a colleague, and no one looked away from the contract lying in the center of the table. The silence had changed from simple confusion into something heavier, something thoughtful. Sunlight slid slowly across the glass wall behind Daniel Whitmore, casting a long reflection over the polished surface of the boardroom table where the unsigned agreement still rested. The fountain pen that had been ready to seal the deal remained exactly where Daniel had set it down, untouched. Ava Brooks stood quietly near the window, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the folder she had brought into the meeting. She did not try to draw attention to herself. She had learned that truth often carried more weight when it was allowed to breathe in silence. The executives seated around the table continued studying the language Ava had pointed out, their expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition as the structure of the clause revealed itself more clearly. Robert Ellis slowly removed his glasses and cleaned them with a small cloth, a habit he had whenever a detail demanded careful reconsideration. "The cross-reference changes everything," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Without it, the agreement would be balanced. With it, the ownership transfers entirely." Daniel Whitmore listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on the contract as if he were measuring the distance between what he had been told about the partnership and what the document actually promised. For decades, he had built his company by trusting preparation, discipline, and careful thinking. Yet, even the most experienced leaders knew that mistakes could hide inside pages that appeared harmless at first glance. Across the table, Victor Kane folded his hands calmly, though the ease he had shown earlier in the meeting had faded into something more controlled. "Contracts evolve during negotiation," he said gently. "If a phrase created confusion, it can always be adjusted. That is the purpose of meetings like this." Daniel Whitmore did not respond immediately. Instead, he slowly stood from his chair and walked toward the window overlooking the city. From 20 floors above the street, the movement of San Francisco looked distant and quiet, tiny cars sliding between buildings and people, crossing intersections like pieces on a chessboard. He remained there for a moment, considering the decision that had almost been made minutes earlier. Then he turned back toward the table. His eyes moved across the room, passing over the board members, the attorneys, and finally resting for a brief moment on Ava Brooks. She met his gaze respectfully, but said nothing. The room felt different now, calmer in a way that only comes when the truth has already entered the conversation and cannot easily be ignored. Daniel returned to his chair, but did not sit down right away. He looked again at the contract, then at Victor Kane, and finally at Robert Ellis. The silence stretched just long enough for everyone present to understand that the meeting had reached a turning point. The agreement that once seemed certain was no longer a formality waiting for a signature. It had become a question that demanded a clear answer before anyone in the room could move forward. Daniel Whitmore remained standing beside the table for a long moment, his eyes moving slowly across the faces in the room as if he were measuring not only the contract but the judgment of every person present. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but the weight behind it made the entire boardroom listen. "Robert," he said quietly, "in your professional opinion, if this document were signed exactly as written, who would ultimately control the technology developed under this partnership?" Robert Ellis did not answer immediately. He opened the contract again, carefully turning to the appendix Ava Brooks had referenced earlier. His finger traced the same line of legal language once more, confirming the interpretation he had already voiced. After a few seconds he looked up. Kane Strategic Ventures would retain the licensing rights and final ownership authority, he said plainly. Whitmore Technologies would carry development responsibility and legal exposure. The words settled heavily in the air. A board member near the end of the table leaned back slowly, exhaling in disbelief. Another executive shook his head, scanning the contract again as if the meaning might somehow change. Daniel Whitmore then turned his attention toward Victor Kane. "When this partnership was presented to my board," he said evenly, "we were told it was a joint development agreement." Victor Kane maintained his composed posture, but the polite confidence that had once filled the room had narrowed into something more guarded. "It is a joint development agreement," Kane replied smoothly. "The language simply organizes the responsibilities in a way that protects long-term growth." Daniel Whitmore lifted the contract slightly from the table and tapped the page where Ava had pointed earlier. "Protects whose growth?" he asked. The question lingered for several seconds. Victor Kane opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Robert Ellis quietly turned another page and cleared his throat. "There is an additional detail," Robert said, his voice thoughtful but firm. "If the ownership clause remains unchanged, Kane Strategic Ventures could legally license the resulting technology to outside companies without Whitmore Technologies' approval." A low murmur moved around the table as the implications became clear. The partnership was not simply unbalanced. It would have allowed another company to control the future of technology Whitmore engineers would spend years developing. Daniel Whitmore slowly placed the contract back on the table. The pen still rested beside it, untouched since the moment Ava Brooks had spoken. He looked briefly toward the young intern standing near the window. Ava did not step forward or interrupt. She simply watched the conversation unfold with the same quiet patience she had shown since the beginning. Daniel Whitmore then turned back toward Victor Kane, his expression no longer uncertain. The realization had settled into place with calm precision. "It seems," he said quietly, "that someone in this room noticed something the rest of us almost missed." His gaze shifted once more toward Ava Brooks, and for the first time since the meeting began, the balance of the room had subtly changed. The intern who had quietly pointed to a single line of legal language was no longer invisible in the boardroom of Whitmore Technologies. Victor Kane no longer looked relaxed. The shift was subtle, almost invisible to someone who did not know how to read a negotiation table. But Daniel Whitmore had spent more than 30 years watching people react when the balance of a deal suddenly changed. Kane adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket and leaned slightly forward, the polite smile returning to his face, though it no longer carried the same certainty it had earlier in the meeting. "Mr. Whitmore," he said evenly, "there is no need to dramatize a clause that can easily be revised. Business agreements evolve during discussion. If your legal team prefers different language, we can modify the ownership framework." His tone was careful, controlled, the voice of a man attempting to steer the conversation back toward familiar ground. But Daniel Whitmore did not immediately sit down or reach for the contract again. Instead, he slowly walked back to his chair and rested both hands on the edge of the table, looking down at the document that had nearly been signed only minutes earlier. "The language did not evolve by accident," Daniel said calmly. "Someone wrote it this way on purpose." No one in the room spoke. Robert Ellis quietly closed the appendix he had been studying, while several board members exchanged brief glances that reflected the same realization. Victor Kane's legal strategy had been carefully hidden behind layers of professional language, but now that it had been exposed, the structure of the agreement felt very different from the partnership that had been promised. Kane remained composed, though a faint tension now appeared in the line of his jaw. Our intention was always collaboration, he replied smoothly. Your engineers develop exceptional systems. Our network brings those systems to the global market. Everyone benefits. Daniel Whitmore lifted the contract once more and slowly closed the folder. The soft sound of paper sliding against paper echoed across the quiet boardroom. Not everyone, he said simply. The words hung in the air longer than any argument could have. For a moment the entire room seemed to pause, absorbing the meaning behind them. Daniel then turned his attention away from the contract and looked toward the far side of the room, where Ava Brooks still stood beside the window. She had not moved since the discussion began, and the sunlight behind her cast a soft reflection across the polished floor. Miss Brooks, Daniel said, his voice calm but clear enough that everyone heard it. Ava straightened slightly, surprised to hear her name spoken again in a room filled with executives who normally conducted billion-dollar decisions without interns present. Daniel continued, his expression thoughtful rather than formal. You have been with Whitmore Technologies for 3 weeks, correct? Yes, sir, Ava answered quietly. And yet you were the only person in this room who noticed that clause before the agreement was signed. Ava hesitated for a moment, unsure how to respond in front of the entire board. I was just reading carefully, she said. Daniel Whitmore nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already believed. Then he looked back toward Victor Kane, the calm certainty in his voice returning fully. It appears, he said, that careful reading just saved this company from giving away the future of its own work. The boardroom remained quiet after Daniel Whitmore's words settled into the air. No one reached for the contract again. The folder rested closed at the center of the polished table, the signature line still empty, the pen beside it now nothing more than a reminder of how close the company had come to making a costly mistake. Victor Kane held his posture for a moment longer, then slowly leaned back in his chair. The confident rhythm he had carried into the meeting was gone. It seems we need to revisit the structure of this agreement, he said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone accustomed to negotiations. Daniel Whitmore nodded once. That would be wise, he replied. But not today. The finality in his voice made it clear that the meeting had reached its conclusion. One by one the executives around the table began closing their folders and organizing their notes. The tension that had filled the room only minutes earlier dissolved into a quieter atmosphere, one shaped by reflection rather than urgency. Robert Ellis gathered the legal documents and slid them into a leather portfolio. Several board members stood from their chairs, still discussing the clause in low voices, each of them aware that the outcome of the meeting had been changed by a detail that could easily have been overlooked. Daniel Whitmore remained near the head of the table, his attention shifting once again toward the young intern standing near the window. Ava Brooks had not spoken since answering his question. She still held the same folder she had carried into the room, unsure whether she should stay or quietly step outside now that the discussion was ending. For a moment Daniel simply observed her, the same thoughtful expression returning to his face that employees across the company recognized when he was evaluating something important. Finally he spoke again. Miss Brooks, he said calmly, how long did it take you to notice that clause? Ava considered the question for a second. About 15 minutes, she answered honestly. A few of the executives who were still standing nearby paused when they heard that. Daniel Whitmore allowed himself a small smile, the first genuine smile he had shown since the meeting began. 15 minutes, he repeated quietly. That is less time than most people in this building spend deciding what to order for lunch. A few soft laughs moved through the room, breaking the tension that had lingered all afternoon. Daniel then reached forward and gently pushed the closed contract away from the center of the table. The movement was simple, but it carried the quiet authority of a decision that had already been made. Whitmore Technologies was built on careful thinking, he said, glancing briefly at the executives around him before looking back at Ava. Today that principle came from someone who was willing to read one more line than everyone else. Ava lowered her eyes modestly, unsure how to respond to the attention. Daniel Whitmore then turned toward Robert Ellis. Make sure Miss Brooks is included in tomorrow's legal strategy review, he said. If she can find a flaw in a $400 million contract, I would like to hear her perspective on the next one before it reaches this table. The boardroom slowly began to empty as executives headed toward the hallway, Their conversations quieter now, thoughtful rather than hurried. Ava remained near the window for a moment longer, watching the sunlight reflect across the glass towers outside. Down on the street far below, the city continued moving exactly as it had before the meeting began, unaware that inside one quiet room a decision had shifted because someone chose to look closely at words others had already assumed were safe.